It was a picture-perfect summer afternoon in one of Atlanta's most prestigious neighborhoods. The sun shimmered off the crystal-clear water of a backyard swimming pool, casting rippling reflections against the elegant two-story home beside it. James Parker, a retired police officer with 15 years of service, leaned back in his lounge chair, soaking in the warmth of the Georgia sun. For the first time in years, he finally felt at peace. James had spent his entire adult life serving his community. He had walked the beat, handled tense situations with grace, and worked countless overtime shifts. He'd saved diligently, skipping vacations and fancy dinners, all with one goal in mind: to own a home in a beautiful, safe neighborhood. It was the kind of dream his parents had only wished for, and after years of sacrifice, it had finally come true. The house was everything he had hoped for: 2,500 square feet of classic Southern charm, with a wraparound porch, towering oak trees in the front yard, and a backyard that looked like something out of a resort brochure. The pool had been his favorite feature from the moment he first toured the property. Sparkling blue water, surrounded by a stone patio with just the right amount of shade from the nearby magnolia trees, it was the perfect place to unwind after a long career spent on high alert. For James, this wasn't just a house, it was proof that hard work and discipline still meant something in America. It was a well-earned reward after years of service, a place where he could finally enjoy the simple pleasures of life: grilling on the weekends, inviting old friends over, and maybe even teaching his future grandkids how to swim one day. But, as he leaned back with his eyes closed, breathing in the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine, his peaceful moment was shattered by the piercing wail of sirens. 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of his house. Officers stepped out, hands near their holsters, their expressions serious. "Sir, we've received a report of a suspicious individual trespassing in this pool area." James sat up, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Through the corner of his eye, he spotted a pair of eyes peeking through lace curtains across the street. His neighbor, Margaret Turner, with her signature smug smile. This wasn't the first time she'd pulled something like this. And little did she know, it was about to be her last. James Parker had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. As a former police officer, he had spent years resolving disputes, calming tempers, and handling difficult individuals with patience and professionalism. But even years of training couldn't have prepared him for his first run-in with Margaret Turner. The day after James moved into his new home, he was busy arranging patio furniture in his backyard when he first noticed her. A figure standing by a second-floor window across the street, phone pressed against her ear, watching him intently. When he waved politely, she disappeared behind her curtains. Odd, but not something he dwelled on. After all, new neighbors often took an interest in who was moving in. It wasn't until later that day that things took a strange turn. James had stepped out to run some errands, but his phone pinged with an alert from his security camera. Curious, he pulled up the footage. There she was, Margaret Turner, walking right through his unlocked backyard gate as if she owned the place. Dressed in an expensive swimsuit and carrying a designer beach towel, she casually laid her things on one of his patio chairs and dipped her feet into his pool. James drove home immediately. As he stepped into his backyard, Margaret looked up, feigning surprise. She placed a manicured hand on her chest and let out an exaggerated gasp. "Oh my," she said sweetly, "I didn't realize you were the new pool maintenance guy. The previous owners always let me use their pool." James kept his expression neutral, though his blood boiled. He had dealt with condescending attitudes before, but this was something else. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'm not the pool maintenance guy. I'm the new owner." Margaret's smile faltered. She blinked, looking him up and down, then let out a nervous laugh. "Oh," she muttered, "there must be some mistake. I know the real estate agent who handled this property," and she never mentioned, she gestured vaguely at him, leaving her implication hanging in the air. "There's no mistake, Mrs. Turner," James replied firmly. "This is my home, and you're trespassing. I'd appreciate it if you asked for permission before stepping onto my property." Margaret's face hardened. As she gathered her things, she muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "We'll see about that." It wasn't a casual remark. It was a promise. At first, James Parker thought Margaret Turner was just an overstepping neighbor, entitled, nosy, and maybe a little too comfortable with bending the rules. But he quickly realized she wasn't just entitled. She was relentless. It started with little things. One morning, James stepped outside to grab his newspaper, only to find it missing. He brushed it off as a fluke, maybe a delivery mistake. But then it happened again. And again. His security cameras soon revealed the culprit, Margaret, slipping out of her house before dawn, snatching his paper like clockwork. Then came the HOA complaints. Despite James meticulously maintaining his lawn, trimming the grass weekly, planting fresh flowers, and keeping his hedges neat, anonymous reports flooded the homeowners association about his unkempt yard and declining property value. The accusations were absurd, but James knew exactly where they were coming from. Then, the trespassing escalated. One Saturday morning, James woke up to the unmistakable sound of splashing. Peering out his bedroom window, he couldn't believe his eyes. Margaret had invited 4 of her friends over for a full-blown pool party in his backyard. Furious, he stormed outside. "Ladies, you need to leave. Now. This is private property." Margaret, lounging in one of his pool chairs, barely glanced up. "Oh, don't be so difficult, James," she said with a dismissive wave. "We're just enjoying a little summer fun. Besides, this pool hardly gets any use." Her friends, sensing the tension, quickly began gathering their things. One woman whispered, Margaret said she had permission, as she hurriedly slipped on her sandals. James kept his composure. "This is your final warning," he said firmly. "Next time, I'm calling the police." Margaret arched an eyebrow. "Go ahead," she sneered. "I know everyone at the precinct. My husband golfs with Captain Richards." That was the moment James knew this wasn't just neighborhood pettiness. Margaret thought she was untouchable. So James did what he had been trained to do, he documented everything. He installed additional security cameras. Within days, the footage caught Margaret testing his back gate, peering through his windows, and, most disturbingly, trying to use an old key from the previous owners. But the final straw? The night James came home to find Margaret had hosted her book club in his backyard. James Parker had spent 15 years in law enforcement, and if there was one lesson he had learned, it was this: never engage without evidence. He had seen too many cases fall apart because someone acted on emotion instead of documentation. Margaret Turner may have thought she was untouchable, but James knew better. If she wanted to play dirty, he would play smart. The morning after her unauthorized book club meeting in his backyard, James got to work. He installed 3 additional security cameras, one covering the back gate, another with a direct view of the pool, and a third discreetly positioned to capture activity near his front yard. If Margaret so much as breathed near his property again, he would have it on video. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. Within days, they captured footage of Margaret testing his gate late at night, peering through his windows, and even attempting to use an old key, likely a copy she had from the previous owners. But the most shocking clip came one morning at 6 a.m. Margaret, clad in her robe and slippers, casually strolled up his driveway, bent down, and stole his newspaper. It would have been almost laughable if it weren't so disturbing. As the days passed, Margaret's harassment escalated. The security footage showed her standing outside his house, snapping photos as if trying to build a case against him. HOA complaints about his overgrown lawn piled up, despite his yard being perfectly manicured. And then, the footage caught something truly unforgivable: Margaret, under the cover of darkness, sprinkling something in his flower beds. James had the soil tested. Sure enough, it was plant killer. This wasn't just entitled behavior anymore. This was malicious. The breaking point came at the next HOA meeting. Margaret, ever the performative neighbor, stood up and declared, "I'm deeply concerned about our property values. Some recent changes in the neighborhood have made certain buyers hesitant." James had been waiting for this moment. He calmly stood, pulled out his phone, and said, "Funny you should mention property values, Margaret. Would you like to explain what you were doing in my yard at 11:47 p.m. last Tuesday?" The room fell silent as he played the footage. Margaret's face turned pale. She had spent months trying to undermine him. Now, it was her reputation on the line. James Parker wasn't a man who acted on impulse. His years as a police officer had taught him that the best way to deal with troublemakers wasn't through confrontation, but through patience, strategy, and undeniable proof. Margaret Turner had spent months harassing him, stealing his newspapers, vandalizing his yard, filing false HOA complaints, and worst of all, repeatedly trespassing in his backyard like it was her personal resort. James had tried to handle things the right way. He had confronted her. He had called the police. He had exposed her at the HOA meeting. But none of it seemed to faze her. If anything, her antics only escalated. That's when James decided that if Margaret wanted to play games in his pool, he was going to make sure she never forgot it. One evening, as James sat on his back porch, reflecting on Margaret's latest intrusion, he remembered a conversation with an old police buddy about a harmless but highly effective pool dye used in maintenance. This particular dye was undetectable in the water, but when it came into contact with specific chemicals found in cosmetics and sunscreen, it turned the skin an unmistakable shade of bright green for days. James did his research. The dye was completely safe, non-toxic, and used by professional pool technicians to detect leaks. More importantly, it wouldn't stain the pool itself, just people who had applied certain high-end sunscreens, the kind Margaret and her well-manicured friends always wore. The plan was simple: set the trap, sit back, and let karma do the rest. James ordered the dye and tested it in a small container of water, using a sample of luxury sunscreen he had found left behind on one of his patio chairs. The reaction was perfect. The water stayed clear, but within seconds, the sunscreen-coated surface turned a vibrant emerald green. Now, all he had to do was wait. Through the neighborhood grapevine, James caught wind of Margaret's latest scheme. She had been telling her inner circle that James barely used his pool and that, as a longtime resident, she had every right to continue enjoying it like she had under the previous owners. That weekend, she was planning a small gathering with her closest friends. James played along. That Saturday morning, he made sure to pack his car and drive off right on schedule, making it clear that the house would be empty for the day. But instead of leaving, he parked around the corner, quietly slipped back into his home office, and turned on his security cameras. It didn't take long. Right at 2 p.m., Margaret and 6 of her friends waltzed through his backyard gate, champagne bottles in hand, their expensive beach towels draped over their arms. The group set up their drinks, turned on soft jazz, and, as expected, slathered on thick layers of their high-end sunscreen before stepping into the water. Margaret was the first to dive in, gliding through the water with the smug confidence of someone who thought she had gotten away with something. Her friends followed, laughing, sipping drinks, and enjoying what they believed was a luxurious free pool day. And then, it happened. One of Margaret's friends let out a startled shriek. "Margaret, your skin." Margaret frowned, looking down at her arms. A distinct green tint was creeping up her forearms, growing darker by the second. Then another woman screamed. And another. Within moments, all of them were splotched with bright green stains. Their arms, their legs, their faces, the expensive makeup they had applied was streaking, leaving them looking like a group of panicked cartoon villains. Margaret, now completely lime green, let out a blood-curdling scream. "What's happening?" she shrieked, scrambling out of the pool, dripping green-stained water onto the pavement. That's when she spotted it, a small, blinking red light. One of James' security cameras. Her face twisted in horror as she realized she had been caught. Again. The exodus that followed was legendary. 7 frantic, green-skinned women bolted out of James' backyard, sprinting through the neighborhood in their dripping designer swimsuits. By that evening, the security footage, expertly edited by James, was all over social media. Within hours, it went viral. The headline? "Entitled neighbor gets green with envy," literally. James didn't have to say a word. The footage spoke for itself: Margaret's repeated trespassing, her smug attitude, and finally, her incredible transformation into a human-sized St. Patrick's Day decoration. The local news picked up the story. HOA members who had been silent before suddenly found their voices. And Margaret? Well, let's just say showing luxury homes became difficult when your skin was the color of fresh-cut grass. 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. James Parker had one. And he hadn't even needed to raise his voice. James Parker had seen plenty of people talk their way out of trouble before. Smooth liars, shameless manipulators, even folks who thought their connections would protect them. But Margaret Turner? She wasn't just arrogant, she was delusional. After the green pool incident, James expected her to lay low, maybe even issue some half-hearted apology. Instead, Margaret did what entitled people do best: she doubled down. First, she tried to spin the story. She posted a video online, her face still sporting a faint green hue, claiming she was the real victim. "I was just trying to maintain our neighborhood standards," she insisted, her voice dripping with condescension. "This was an attack on my reputation." Unfortunately for her, the internet wasn't buying it. The video only made things worse. Within hours, it went viral, not for the reasons she hoped. The comments were merciless. "The Wicked Witch of Atlanta. What standards are you maintaining by trespassing? Lady, you got what you deserved." It didn't stop there. Margaret's real estate business took a major hit. Homeowners in the area flooded her company's social media with green emojis. Potential clients backed out of deals. The agency, desperate to salvage its reputation, released a public statement. "We take property rights very seriously. The actions depicted in the now viral video do not reflect our company's values." Translation? You're on your own, Margaret. Then came the neighborhood backlash. People who had once stayed silent suddenly found their voices. Stories of Margaret's bullying and entitlement spread like wildfire. The Johnsons came forward, revealing how she had once tried to get their kids' basketball hoop banned because it was too disruptive. Mrs. Rodriguez, a kind woman who had lived there for 20 years, admitted Margaret had reported her Christmas decorations as not fitting the neighborhood aesthetic. The final blow came when Margaret tried to organize a neighborhood meeting to discuss dangerous chemicals in pools. Only 3 people showed up. And all 3 were wearing green ribbons, in silent support of James. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign went up in front of her house. And James? He never said a word. He didn't have to. Margaret had spent months trying to ruin his reputation. In the end, she had destroyed her own. For years, the neighborhood had been quiet, not in a friendly way, but in the kind of silence that comes when people keep to themselves, avoiding unnecessary interactions. Margaret Turner had played a big role in that. She had positioned herself as the unofficial gatekeeper of the community, dictating who belonged and who didn't, using HOA complaints and passive-aggressive tactics to keep people in line. But after her very public downfall, things began to shift. It started with little moments. James Parker, who had once been greeted with wary glances, now found neighbors stopping by his front yard just to chat. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2 doors down, who had always kept her head down after Margaret targeted her holiday decorations, brought over a tray of homemade empanadas. "I should have spoken up sooner," she admitted, handing him the warm dish. "She tried to make me feel like I didn't belong here." The Johnsons, whose kids had once been scolded by Margaret for playing too loudly, dusted off their old basketball hoop and set it up again. When James walked by one evening, their son waved and called out, "Hey Mr. Parker, wanna play?" In the pool, the very thing that had sparked months of conflict, became a symbol of change. James, knowing how much joy it could bring, decided to host a proper neighborhood pool party, one with actual invitations and real permission. Families showed up, kids splashed in the water, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community. Tom, a longtime resident, chuckled as he helped James set up the grill. "You know," he said, flipping a burger, "I've lived here for 20 years. And this is the first time I feel like I know my neighbors." Even the new homeowners who bought Margaret's house, an interracial couple with twin daughters, were welcomed with open arms. Their girls were on the local swim team, and James happily let them practice in his pool. The HOA meetings, once dominated by complaints about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, became shorter, friendlier, and far less tense. And whenever someone brought up Margaret's name, it was met with laughter and a knowing shake of the head. James had never set out to change the neighborhood. But by standing his ground, he had done something even better: he had brought it together. James Parker never set out for revenge, he simply wanted to live in peace. But when faced with entitlement, harassment, and outright disrespect, he knew he had to stand his ground. Not with anger, not with aggression, but with patience, strategy, and a little creativity. In the end, Margaret Turner's downfall wasn't about getting even, it was about showing that bullies thrive when people stay silent. By documenting, exposing, and letting karma take its course, James not only protected himself but helped create a stronger, more united community. Life often presents us with difficult people, those who believe rules don't apply to them, who take advantage of kindness, and who mistake silence for weakness. The story of James Parker and Margaret Turner is more than just a tale of neighborhood drama, it's a lesson in resilience, patience, and knowing when to take a stand. One of the greatest takeaways from James' experience is the power of documentation and strategy. Instead of reacting with anger or confrontation, he chose to observe, gather evidence, and let the truth speak for itself. In a world where entitlement can run unchecked, having proof, whether through security cameras, written records, or community support, can be the difference between frustration and justice. Another lesson is that bullies thrive when good people stay silent. Margaret had been intimidating neighbors for years, using social pressure and manipulation to control the community. But once her actions were exposed, those same neighbors found their voices. Sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up to a bully to inspire others to do the same. James also demonstrated that revenge isn't always about retaliation, it's about wisdom. Instead of escalating the situation with hostility, he allowed karma to play out in a way that was fair, legal, and, let's be honest, deeply satisfying. His approach wasn't about harming Margaret, it was about holding her accountable for her actions. Most importantly, this story reminds us that community matters. A neighborhood, a workplace, even a group of old friends, these spaces are stronger when people support each other. Margaret's departure wasn't just a win for James, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood, which became more connected, welcoming, and fair because of it. So if you ever find yourself dealing with someone like Margaret, remember, you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to be aggressive to win. Sometimes, the best way to handle entitlement is to let it unravel itself, with a little patience, a little preparation, and maybe even a little humor along the way.